Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at King Tut.
King Tut.
You probably know him as the Boy King,
Right.
but is that really the full story?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to investigate some really amazing new findings from his tomb that are changing how we understand his life and reign. We've got some incredible sources to work with.
Okay.
Excerpts from 2 National Geographic documentaries, King Tut's Treasures, Hidden Secrets Rediscovered, and Live a Day in the Life of King Tut.
Right.
Plus some fascinating insights from his Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
So our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to uncover the truth about Tutankhamun,
Okay.
exploring the evidence and analyzing what it really tells us.
Sounds good.
So when we think about King Tut, that traditional image that comes to mind is often of like this frail boy king who died tragically young.
Right.
And that image is largely based on a small fraction of the 5,000 objects found in his tomb that were displayed in the Cairo Museum.
Right.
But the majority of those artifacts have been in storage, unexamined until recently.
Exactly. And what's particularly exciting is that the new Grand Egyptian Museum is finally bringing together all 5,398 artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb for the first time since its discovery in 1922.
Wow.
So this offers, like a really unique chance to kind of re-examine his story and see if the traditional image of a frail young pharaoh holds up.
Because let's face it, I mean, the dazzling gold treasures,
Yeah.
like his iconic death mask,
Yeah.
those are usually what come to mind when we think of King Tut.
Right.
But the documentaries highlight that those famous pieces are just a tiny fraction of what was actually found in his tomb.
Exactly. The majority of those objects have been in storage, largely unexamined for almost a century.
A century.
Imagine the potential insights we may have missed just by focusing on the glyphs and glamour.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think about all those hidden stories just waiting to be uncovered. And one of the most surprising revelations from the documentaries is the sheer quantity of weapons found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It wasn't just gold and jewels, it was practically an armory.
It was. We're talking 6 chariots, dozens of bows, hundreds of arrows, throw sticks, daggers, shields, even a sophisticated suit of armor.
Wow.
It certainly challenges the image of a weak and sickly king, doesn't it?
It really does. It's like he was preparing for war or perhaps even like actively engaged in conflict.
Yeah.
Could this be why he died so young?
Well-
Maybe he wasn't simply a boy king who succumbed to illness, but a ruler, like facing real danger, fighting to defend his kingdom.
To understand that possibility, we need to consider the broader context of Egypt during Tutankhamun's reign. Remember, he became pharaoh at just 9 years old
9 years old.
and ruled for a decade. That's not insignificant, especially given the challenges Egypt faced during that period.
Right. The documentaries touch on the fact that Egypt was dealing with threats on multiple fronts at the time.
Exactly. There were rebellions in Nubia, a region to the south that was vital to Egypt's economy because it was a major source of gold and other valuable resources. Then there were the Libyan tribes, constantly launching raids from the northwest. And to top it all off, the Hittites, a powerful empire to the east, were encroaching on Egyptian territory. So it's not hard to see why Tutankhamun might have felt the need to be, well-equipped militarily.
It makes you wonder if those weapons were purely symbolic or if he actually used them in battle. Speaking of weapons, one object in particular really caught my attention. It's the iron dagger found on Tutankhamun's mummified body.
Ah, yes. The iron dagger. Now, that's where things get really interesting. In ancient Egypt, iron was incredibly rare, even more so than gold. So finding an iron dagger in Tutankhamun's tomb raised a lot of questions.
How did they even get iron? Was it imported from another civilization?
Well, that's the mystery scientists have been trying to solve for years. And through non-destructive X-ray analysis, they were finally able to determine that the iron in that dagger didn't come from Earth at all.
Wait, are you saying it came from space?
Precisely. The analysis revealed that the proportion of nickel in the blade matched that found in meteorites. Essentially, Tutankhamun's dagger was made from iron that fell from the sky.
It makes you wonder if those battle scenes we see depicted on some of the artifacts might be more than just artistic interpretations. Maybe they represent real battles that Tutankhamun participated in, but wouldn't a dagger made from a meteorite have been considered incredibly valuable? More of a ceremonial object than a practical weapon.
That's certainly possible. However, to the ancient Egyptians, something that fell from the sky would have been seen as a gift from the gods. Can you imagine the significance that dagger must have held for Tutankhamun?
Absolutely. It must have felt imbued with power and maybe even a sense of destiny. It's not exactly the kind of weapon you'd expect a boy king to be buried with.
And speaking of unexpected finds, the documentaries also showcased the meticulous work done by conservators to restore some of Tutankhamun's possessions. One project that stood out was the reconstruction of his chariot decorations. It took years to piece together over 1,500 gold flakes. They were initially dismissed as mere fragments.
I remember that. And those decorations weren't just standard Egyptian motifs either, right? They incorporated designs from other cultures.
You're absolutely right. We see depictions of a griffin, a mythical creature popular in Near Eastern art. There are also Syrian plant motifs, and even a Minoan running spiral, a design characteristic of the ancient Minoan civilization from the island of Crete.
It's fascinating to see those foreign influences incorporated into Tutankhamun's chariot. It definitely suggests he was more than just an isolated Egyptian ruler. Maybe he saw himself as a player on the international stage.
Or perhaps he was aiming to project an image of power and influence that extended beyond Egypt's borders. It's like he was curating his image, using these diverse artistic elements to send a message about his authority and reach.
It's almost like a PR campaign for his reign. But let's talk about another chariot that's getting ready to be transported to the Grand Egyptian Museum. This one has a much darker theme, a frieze depicting captured enemies.
Yes, and the detail is quite striking. The captives are bound at their necks, wrists, and above their heads, and their clothing and hairstyles identify them as enemies from both the south and north of Egypt, perhaps Nubians and Libyans.
It makes you wonder if this is purely symbolic or if it reflects actual military campaigns led by Tutankhamun. It's not just a stylized depiction of warfare, it's a brutal scene of subjugation.
It certainly raises questions about how we interpret ancient artwork. Is it propaganda, a record of real events, or perhaps a blend of both? And if these scenes are based in reality, it further challenges the traditional image of Tutankhamun as a passive boy king.
Speaking of challenging perceptions, we can't forget about the unique suit of armor found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It's unlike anything else ever discovered in ancient Egypt. This isn't just a ceremonial piece, it's battle-ready gear.
Over 2,000 leather scales, painstakingly stitched together with overlapping ridges to provide both flexibility and protection.
The ancient leather specialist who examined it for the documentary believes it was designed to deflect arrows, basically the Kevlar vest of the ancient world.
And she suggests that the scales might have been molded, which would explain their consistency in size and shape, potentially hinting at mass production techniques.
It's hard to imagine that such elaborate armor would have been just for show. It suggests that Tutankhamun was preparing for, or perhaps even engaged in, actual combat.
A far cry from the image of a frail, sickly boy king, isn't it? It suggests a ruler who was actively involved in defending his kingdom, a warrior king, not just a figurehead.
It really does make you wonder, like, what else we might discover, as those thousands of objects from his tomb are studied in more detail. And, while we're on the topic of Tutankhamun as a potential warrior, there's a bow in his collection that's particularly interesting.
The one decorated with images of his enemies.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a powerful piece.
Exactly. The documentary showed how it had Nubians on one side and then Asiatics on the other. It's almost like a visual representation of the threats that Tutankhamun faced from both the south and the north.
And to understand who those enemies were, we need to delve a bit deeper into ancient Egyptian geography and history. Nubia, as we mentioned, was a region south of Egypt, known for its gold mines and other valuable resources. But maintaining control over Nubia was a constant challenge for Egyptian pharaohs. During Tutankhamun's time, there were several Nubian uprisings that threatened Egypt's economic stability and access to those resources.
So those Nubian figures on the bow weren't just symbolic.
Right.
They represented a real and pressing danger to Tutankhamun's rule.
Precisely. And the Asiatics on the other side of the bow would likely represent groups like the Libyans, who were known for their raiding parties that often targeted Egypt's western border. But the term Asiatics could also encompass a much larger group of people from regions to the east of Egypt, including the Hittites.
The Hittites, weren't they a pretty formidable force in the ancient world?
They were indeed. The Hittite Empire was a major power player in the region, and they were constantly vying for control over territories that bordered Egypt. In fact, some historians believe that conflict with the Hittites might have been one of the defining challenges of Tutankhamun's reign.
So this bow, with its depiction of Nubians and Asiatics, It really gives us a glimpse into the geopolitical landscape that Tutankhamun had to navigate. It wasn't just about, internal stability. He was dealing with threats from multiple directions.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that ancient Egypt wasn't an isolated civilization. It was part of a complex network of interactions, both peaceful and hostile, with neighboring cultures and empires.
And those interactions are often vividly depicted in the artwork found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The documentaries focused on one box in particular that was decorated with elaborate battle scenes.
Yes, those scenes are quite striking. We see Tutankhamun in his chariot, drawing his bow, with enemies falling all around him. Initially, those scenes were interpreted as purely symbolic representations of the pharaoh's power. But there's a detail that suggests they might be more than just artistic fantasy.
You mean the fact that the weapons depicted in those scenes match the actual weapons found in Tutankhamun's tomb?
Exactly. It suggests a level of intentionality, almost like he was documenting his military achievements, or at least the type of warfare he might have been engaged in.
So it's possible those scenes are giving us a glimpse into real battles that took place during his reign.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering. And what's even more intriguing is that these battle scenes aren't confined to objects found within Tutankhamun's tomb. Archaeologists have been piecing together fragments of similar scenes from Luxor Temple, a massive complex that was built and expanded over centuries by various pharaohs.
I've always wanted to visit Luxor Temple. It's incredible to think that they're finding pieces of Tutankhamun's story embedded in its very structure.
It is quite remarkable. And what makes these fragments from Luxor Temple even more compelling is that they're not just stylized depictions of warfare. They include graphic details that suggest a level of realism not typically seen in ancient Egyptian art.
I remember the documentary showed images of severed hands on sticks and a prisoner caged and hanging from a mast. It's pretty intense stuff.
Those details are definitely chilling, and they suggest that these carvings might be records of specific events, perhaps even real campaigns led by Tutankhamun himself.
It's definitely not the image of a peaceful boy king that we're used to seeing. It paints a much more complex and perhaps even ruthless picture of Tutankhamun as a ruler. But speaking of contrasting images, the biggest mystery surrounding Tutankhamun is, of course, his death at such a young age.
He was only 19 when he died, and for decades, experts have debated the cause. Is it malaria? Septicemia? A blow to the head? There's evidence to support various theories.
But the documentaries suggest that maybe the key to understanding Tutankhamun's death lies not in how he died, but where.
That's a fascinating angle. X-rays of Tutankhamun's skull show 2 layers of resin, which is unusual, and suggest a 2-part mummification process. This is something we don't typically see in royal mummies from this period.
Why would they've done that? Was it a mistake?
It's possible he died far from home, perhaps on a military campaign. A hasty mummification might have been necessary to preserve the body before it could be transported back to Egypt for the full royal burial rites.
That makes sense, but there's another unusual detail about Tutankhamun's mummy. His heart is missing.
Yes, the missing heart. In ancient Egyptian belief, the heart played a vital role in the afterlife. It was believed to be weighed against a feather by the god Anubis to determine the deceased's worthiness to enter the underworld.
So for Tutankhamun to be buried without his heart is a pretty big deal. Does it mean the embalmers made a mistake? Or was there something else going on?
Well, considering the possibility that he died far from home and was initially mummified quickly to prevent decomposition, it's possible that the embalmers were working under less than ideal conditions. They may not have had access to the same tools and expertise as they would have had in the royal workshops.
So are we suggesting that Tutankhamun might have died in battle? That's a pretty bold theory.
It's definitely a possibility worth considering. And the documentary pointed out that around the estimated time of Tutankhamun's death, Egyptian armies were campaigning in northern Syria, hundreds of miles from home, fighting, you guessed it, the Hittites, the same enemies depicted on that bow we talked about earlier.
Wow, so if he was leading those armies or even just present on the battlefield, it would explain the rushed mummification and the missing heart.
Exactly. It all starts to add up. The weapons, the armor, the battle scenes, the unusual mummification, it paints a very different picture of Tutankhamun than the one we've traditionally been taught.
It's amazing how new technologies and research are allowing us to re-examine the past and potentially rewrite history. But even if Tutankhamun wasn't a warrior king in the traditional sense, there's no doubt that he was a ruler who understood the power of imagery and symbolism.
Absolutely. And the way he chose to be buried, surrounded by those weapons,
Yeah.
those battle scenes, tells us a lot about how he wanted to be remembered. It's like he was saying, don't don't judge me by my age or by the fact that I died young. See me as a powerful warrior, a protector of Egypt.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much control he actually had over the design of his tomb and the arrangement of the objects within it. Was it something he planned meticulously during his lifetime, or was it more a reflection of how his advisors and priests wanted him to be remembered?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, we may never know for sure. But what we can say is that the objects themselves, regardless of who chose them for the tomb, tell a compelling story. And they challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about this iconic figure from ancient history.
Like, take those chariot decorations we talked about earlier, the ones with the griffin and the Syrian plant motifs and the Minoan running spiral.
Right.
Those weren't just random choices, were they?
Hey, not at all.
Yeah.
Those designs incorporating elements from different cultures suggest a deliberate effort to present Tutankhamun as a ruler with international connections and influence.
It's like he was trying to project an image of power and sophistication that extended beyond Egypt's borders.
Precisely. And that same intentionality can be seen in the placement of the weapons and the depiction of the battle scenes. It's almost like he was curating his own image for posterity, ensuring that future generations would see him not as a frail boy king, but as a strong and capable leader.
And you can't deny that it worked. I mean, Tutankhamun's tomb is the most famous in the Valley of the Kings.
Yeah.
It's captured the world's imagination for over a century.
It's amazing to think that a ruler who died so young, whose reign was relatively short, has had such a profound and enduring impact on our understanding of ancient Egypt.
And to think, for decades, most of these incredible objects were hidden away in storage. Tutankhamun's story is still unfolding, revealing new layers of meaning with each discovery and each new analysis.
The new Grand Egyptian Museum is going to be a game changer, I think. Having all those objects together displayed in a modern museum setting, it's going to allow researchers and the public alike to see them in a whole new light.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what other secrets are waiting to be uncovered, what other pieces of the puzzle are still out there just waiting to be found.
It's an exciting time to be studying ancient Egypt. With all the new technologies and research methods available, who knows what we might discover next?
Right.
Tutankhamun's story reminds us that history is not static. It's a constantly evolving narrative, shaped by new evidence and new interpretations.
So what does it all mean? Was Tutankhamun a warrior king who met an untimely end on a distant battlefield? Or was he a shrewd strategist who carefully crafted his image for eternity, ensuring that he would be remembered not for his youth, but for his strength and his power?
Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe he's a bit of both.
Yeah.
A young ruler thrust into a turbulent world who rose to the challenge and sought to leave his mark on history. Whatever the answer, Tutankhamun's story continues to fascinate us, challenging our assumptions and reminding us that there's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to understand about the past.
Thanks for joining us for today's deep dive. We'll see you next time.